The man placed a $5 million check on Elvis Presley's table like he was laying down a weapon. Not a gift, not an offer. A weapon. And the moment Elvis read the attached note, the air inside the dressing room changed so violently that even the bodyguards near the door stopped breathing. 3 words came out of Elvis's mouth, slow, cold, deadly calm. Get out. Now. February 12th, 1974, Las Vegas Hilton. Outside, thousands of fans were still screaming Elvis's name. The casino floor below vibrated with music, laughter, slot machines, cigarette smoke, and money changing hands faster than oxygen. Elvis had just walked off stage after another sold-out performance. Sweat still clung to the collar of his white rhinestone jumpsuit. His chest rose heavily from exhaustion. He looked drained, older than his years, but the crowd had loved him anyway. They always did. Inside the dressing room, the atmosphere was quieter. Dim lights, half-empty bottles of water, towels tossed across chairs, a faint smell of cologne mixed with stage sweat and cigar smoke drifting in from the hallway. Elvis sat in front of the mirror removing one of his rings when someone knocked. Joe Esposito cracked the door open. A man stood there in a charcoal Italian suit so expensive it almost looked unreal. Everything about him screamed power. Perfect haircut, gold watch, shoes polished like mirrors. In one hand sat a leather briefcase that probably cost more than most people's rent for a year. "I need 5 minutes with Mr. Presley," the man said smoothly. "Business opportunity." Joe instantly disliked him. The guy smiled too easily, like someone who had spent his entire life buying people. "Elvis is resting," Joe replied. But Elvis looked up from the mirror. "Let him in." Joe hesitated. "Elvis, 5 minutes." The businessman stepped inside with the confidence of someone who believed every room already belonged to him. "My name is Richard Ashford," he said, extending his hand. "I'm here to make you the most profitable offer of your life." Elvis shook his hand once. No smile, no warmth. He had heard versions of this speech for 20 years. Movie producers, oil men, politicians, casino owners. Everybody wanted a piece of Elvis Presley. Richard slowly placed the briefcase on the coffee table and opened it with deliberate precision. Click. Inside sat a white envelope. He slid it across the table. Elvis opened it casually at first, then his eyes narrowed. $5 million. Joe almost choked. In 1974, that amount of money was insane. Enough to buy mansions, planes, entire businesses. Enough to make grown men lose their morality overnight. But Elvis didn't touch the check again. "What exactly am I selling for $5 million?" he asked quietly. Richard sat down without invitation. "One song." Elvis stared at him. "That's it?" "One private performance, 20 minutes. You sing Can't Help Falling in Love at an exclusive event I'm hosting next week." Joe let out a low whistle. "Elvis." But Elvis remained still. His instincts had started whispering already. Something felt wrong. Too much money. Too rehearsed. "What kind of event?" Elvis asked. Richard smiled. "My son's birthday." A small pause. "He's turning 8. Elvis relaxed slightly. Children softened him instantly. They always had. "Well," Elvis said, "you don't need to pay me $5 million for that." Richard's smile faded almost invisibly. My son is dying. Silence. Real silence. The kind that presses against your ears. Elvis slowly leaned back in his chair. What? Leukemia, Richard said flatly. 3 years now. Doctors say maybe 2 weeks left, maybe less. Joe looked toward the floor. Even the air inside the room seemed heavier now. Elvis's expression changed immediately. The suspicion disappeared for a moment, and genuine pain took its place. That's terrible, he said softly. Richard nodded once, emotionless. My son loves your music, especially Can't Help Falling in Love. I want his final birthday to be unforgettable. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Elvis looked down at the check again, then back at Richard. You can keep the money, Elvis said. I'll come sing for him anyway. Most men would have cried hearing that. Richard Ashford only adjusted his cufflinks. No, he replied calmly. I insist on paying. That sentence hit Elvis strangely. Insist. Not offer. Not appreciate. Insist. Like he wasn't helping a dying child. Like he was purchasing property. Something cold slid down Elvis's spine. You don't need to buy kindness from me, Elvis said carefully. This isn't kindness, Richard replied. It's business. The room cooled another 10 degrees. Joe's eyes moved toward Elvis. He knew that look. Elvis's jaw had tightened. Whenever Elvis got quiet like this, somebody usually regretted something. Richard opened another folder from the briefcase. I have the full event planned already. He spread papers across the table. Schedules, layouts, guest lists, catering plans, security routes. At first glance, it looked impressive. Then Elvis started reading the names. Executives, investors, politicians, Hollywood producers, casino owners. No children. Not one. Elvis frowned. These are your guests? Yes. For an 8-year-old birthday party? Richard smiled again, but now the smile looked artificial. Well, it's also a networking opportunity. That was the exact moment everything changed. Elvis slowly lowered the papers. The room became deadly still. What do you mean, networking opportunity? Richard leaned back confidently. I'm combining business with family, influential people together in one room, a legendary performance, a memorable evening. Memorable. The word echoed in Elvis's skull like a gunshot. Suddenly he understood. This wasn't about a little boy. Not really. Christopher Ashford wasn't the center of this party. He was decoration, a tragic centerpiece for rich people to sip champagne around. Elvis's eyes hardened. Where are the kids' friends? Richard blinked. What? His school friends, Elvis repeated. Cousins, neighborhood kids. I don't see any children here. Richard shifted slightly for the first time. He's been sick a long time. That ain't what I asked. The businessman's confidence flickered. Elvis, you have to understand. No, Elvis interrupted quietly. I think I understand perfectly. Joe looked at him carefully. The temperature in the room was rising fast now. Elvis stood up slowly. Not angry yet. Worse. Disappointed. You're throwing a party for your business friends, Elvis said, and your dying son's the attraction. Richard's face tightened. That's not true. You want people talking about you, Elvis continued. You want them saying Richard Ashford is powerful enough to get Elvis Presley to sing while his poor dying son sits there making everybody emotional. That's unfair, is it? Richard stood up too. My son asked for you. Then bring him to my show, Elvis snapped instantly. Front row, backstage. I'll spend the whole night with him if I have to. Richard opened his mouth, but Elvis wasn't done. What kind of father throws a birthday party with 100 strangers for an 8-year-old kid? He wanted something special. No, Elvis fired back. You wanted something unforgettable. Silence crashed into the room again. Richard's face turned red. You don't know anything about my family. And you don't know anything about love, Elvis said coldly. The words landed like bricks. Joe had seen Elvis angry before, but this was different. This wasn't celebrity ego. This was personal. Elvis grew up poor. He knew what real people looked like when they suffered. He knew what genuine pain sounded like. And Richard Ashford sounded rehearsed, manufactured, empty. You're trying to turn your son into a story people talk about over cocktails, Elvis said.
That boy's dying, and you're planning entertainment schedules. Richard pointed toward the check aggressively. That is $5 million. Elvis looked at it one last time, then directly into Richard's eyes. And in a voice so calm it became terrifying, he said, Get out. Now. The room froze solid. Richard stared at him in disbelief. What did you say? I said get out now before I throw you out myself. You're making a huge mistake. I can live with that. Richard grabbed the check violently. You have no idea who you're talking to. Elvis stepped closer. I don't care if you own half the country, he said quietly. You don't use a dying child to impress rich men. For the first time that night, Richard Ashford looked small. Not powerless. Small. He shoved the papers into his briefcase with shaking hands and stormed toward the door. Before leaving, he turned back one final time. You'll regret this. But Elvis didn't answer, because he was already thinking about the little boy he had never met, and something deep inside him suddenly hurt. The door slammed shut. The walls shook. Joe exhaled slowly. Elvis, he whispered. That was $5 million. Elvis stared at the closed door for several long seconds. Then he said something Joe would remember for the rest of his life. That wasn't money. He looked toward the check marks still pressed into the table from the envelope. That was blood money. And deep down, Elvis already knew he wasn't finished with Christopher Ashford yet. Elvis Presley couldn't sleep that night. The Las Vegas Hilton suite was silent, except for the distant ringing of slot machines bleeding through the walls like ghosts. Half-drunk coffee sat cold beside the bed. The television flickered without sound, but Elvis never looked at it once. All he could see was one thing. An 8-year-old boy, alone, surrounded by strangers at a birthday party that wasn't really for him. At 3:17 in the morning, Elvis finally stood up, grabbed the phone beside the bed, and dialed Memphis. His secretary answered groggily. Judy speaking. Judy, Elvis said quietly. I need you to find somebody for me. There was something in his voice that instantly woke her up. Who? Richard Ashford, New York businessman. He's got a little boy named Christopher. Leukemia. A pause. I need the hospital. Elvis. Tonight. His voice cracked slightly on that last word. That almost never happened.
Judy understood immediately this wasn't business anymore. This was personal. By sunrise, Elvis was standing alone near the hotel window, staring out across Las Vegas. Neon lights blinked endlessly below him, like a city pretending happiness didn't expire. But all Elvis could think about was time, how terrifyingly fast it disappeared. 2 weeks, maybe less. A child shouldn't understand death before learning multiplication tables. And somehow, that thought hit Elvis harder than anything else. By noon the next day, Judy called back. "Columbia Presbyterian Hospital," she said softly. "Pediatric Oncology Wing." Elvis closed his eyes. "Thank you. You gonna tell the press?" "No." "Your manager?" "No." "Anybody?" Elvis looked out the window again. That little boy's been turned into enough of a show already. Then he hung up. 2 days later, Elvis Presley boarded a private jet to New York, wearing dark sunglasses, a black coat, and carrying only one thing besides his luggage: his guitar. No cameras followed him, no reporters, no publicity team. Just Elvis. The flight felt longer than usual, because for once, Elvis wasn't traveling as a star. He was traveling as a human being, trying to fix something broken before it disappeared forever. Rain covered Manhattan when he arrived. Gray skies, cold wind. The city looked exhausted. Perfect match for how Elvis felt inside. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and sadness. Children's drawings covered the walls in desperate colors: smiling suns, cartoon animals, crayon rainbows trying to hide the reality inside those rooms. Elvis stood near the nurses' station while several exhausted nurses looked up and froze. One of them nearly dropped her clipboard. Another whispered, "Oh my God." Elvis gave a small, embarrassed smile. "Hey, ma'am, I'm looking for Christopher Ashford." The nurses stared like they were hallucinating. "You're Elvis Presley." "That's what they tell me." A few nurses laughed nervously, but one older nurse noticed something important immediately. He wasn't here as a celebrity. There were no photographers, no assistants, no ego, just tired eyes and concern. "He's in room 417, she said softly. "Is his family inside?" "His mother stepped out for coffee. Father isn't here." Elvis nodded slowly. Of course he isn't. That thought burned hotter than it should have. He walked down the hallway alone. Every room he passed felt heavy. Tiny bodies connected to machines. Parents pretending to smile. Children trying to be brave because adults around them were already falling apart. Elvis's chest tightened harder with every step. By the time he reached room 417, he almost stopped walking. Not because he was nervous to meet Christopher, because he suddenly realized something terrifying. This little boy probably didn't have much time left, and Elvis had wasted 2 entire days getting there. He gently pushed the door open. Christopher Ashford sat upright in bed, watching television with the sound muted. He looked smaller than Elvis imagined. So small.
The chemotherapy had taken his hair. His skin looked pale and fragile beneath the hospital lights. An IV line disappeared into his tiny arm. But his eyes were alive, bright, curious, still fighting. The room itself felt painfully lonely. Get well cards taped to walls, plastic flowers, unused toys, a birthday balloon slowly losing air in the corner. Elvis felt his throat tighten immediately. Christopher turned casually toward the door,
then froze. For a second, the boy looked genuinely terrified, like his brain couldn't process what it was seeing. Elvis slowly removed his sunglasses. "Hey there, buddy." Christopher's mouth opened slightly. No sound came out. Elvis smiled gently and pulled a chair beside the bed. "I heard somebody in New York's been listening to my records." Still silence. The little boy blinked rapidly. "You're really Elvis Presley?" His voice barely existed above a whisper. "That's what my mama says." Christopher suddenly laughed. A tiny laugh, weak, but real, and the sound hit Elvis like a punch directly to the heart, because sick children weren't supposed to sound that fragile. Elvis leaned the guitar case against the bed. "Well," he said softly, "I couldn't make it to your birthday party." Christopher's face dropped slightly. Elvis noticed immediately. "So, I figured maybe I'd come early instead." The boy stared at him. "You came for me?" "Course I did." "Why?" The question shattered Elvis internally, because Christopher asked it like nobody had ever chosen him before. Not fully, not without conditions. Elvis looked at the child carefully before answering. "Because you matter." Christopher's eyes immediately watered, and suddenly Elvis understood something horrifying. This child wasn't starving for gifts. He was starving for attention, real attention, not hospital pity, not adult sympathy. Connection. Elvis slowly opened the guitar case. "Well now," he said quietly, "you got any requests?" Christopher's lips trembled.
Can't help falling in love. Elvis nodded once.
"Good choice." Then he started playing, softly, slowly. The hospital room transformed instantly. Outside, machines still beeped, nurses still hurried through hallways, rain still crashed against New York windows. But inside room 417, everything slowed down. Elvis sang quietly enough that it almost felt personal, like the song belonged only to Christopher now. "Wise men say." Christopher stared at him without blinking, not because Elvis was famous, because for the first time in a very long time, somebody was fully present with him, not looking at watches, not answering phones, not networking, not pretending, just there. By the second verse, tears rolled down Christopher's face silently. Elvis kept singing anyway. "Take my hand." The boy reached out slowly. Elvis took it immediately, and Christopher squeezed surprisingly hard, like he was afraid Elvis might disappear if he let go. When the song ended, neither of them spoke for several seconds. Then Christopher whispered something so quietly, Elvis almost missed it. "My dad said you were too busy." Elvis's stomach twisted violently. He forced a smile anyway. "Well, dads don't know everything." Christopher looked down at the blanket. "He's always busy." Those 4 words carried more loneliness than most adults speak in a lifetime. Elvis suddenly understood why the party existed. Not for Christopher, for Richard. Because throwing giant events was easier than sitting beside a dying child and admitting you were terrified. And maybe Richard Ashford wasn't evil. Maybe he was just a coward. But children always suffer the most from cowardice. Elvis leaned forward slightly. "You know something, buddy?" "What?" "I think big parties are overrated." Christopher smiled weakly. Me too. That made Elvis laugh, a real laugh this time. And slowly, over the next 2 hours, room 417 stopped feeling like a hospital room. It became something else, a memory.
Elvis taught Christopher simple guitar chords. Christopher's fingers struggled to reach properly, but Elvis never rushed him once. "That's it," Elvis encouraged softly. "You got it." Christopher grinned proudly after finally hitting the note. "There you go!" Nobody had celebrated him like that in a very long time. Elvis told him stories about forgetting lyrics on stage, about karate, about crazy fans chasing limousines, about getting nervous before concerts even after all those years. Christopher laughed so hard at one story he started coughing. Elvis instantly leaned forward in panic. "You okay?" Christopher nodded while laughing. "That was funny." And for a moment, just one moment, he looked like a normal little boy again. Not a patient, not a diagnosis, not a tragedy, just a child. Near evening, Christopher suddenly asked quietly, "Am I gonna die?" The question hit the room like a gunshot. Elvis stopped moving. The machines continued beeping softly behind them. Rain tapped against the glass. Christopher stared at him carefully, waiting, because children always know when adults lie. And Elvis realized this might be the most important answer he ever gave anyone. He leaned closer, slowly. "I think," Elvis said carefully, "everybody gets scared sometimes." "That's not what I asked." Elvis's chest tightened painfully. Christopher looked so small in that hospital bed, too small for questions like this. Finally, Elvis reached over and adjusted the blanket around him gently. "I think," he whispered, "you're one of the bravest little men I ever met." Christopher's eyes filled again. "But what if I'm scared?" Elvis swallowed hard. Then he took off the scarf around his neck, the same scarf from his Vegas show, and placed it carefully into Christopher's hands. "Then you hold on to this." Christopher looked down at it like treasure. "And whenever you feel scared," Elvis whispered, "you remember something." "What?" Elvis smiled sadly. "That Elvis Presley came all the way to New York just to hang out with you." Christopher finally broke down crying, and this time, Elvis cried too. When Elvis finally stood to room 417, neither of them wanted the moment to end. Christopher still clutched the scarf tightly against his chest, like it was something alive. Outside the hospital window, New York had disappeared beneath freezing rain and darkness. The city lights blurred through the glass like distant stars drowning underwater. Elvis looked at the little boy one last time. Christopher looked exhausted now, the kind of exhaustion children should never understand. But for the first time since Elvis walked in, he didn't look lonely anymore. That mattered. More than fame, more than money, more than anything. "You gonna come back?" Christopher asked quietly. The question nearly broke Elvis apart. Because he wanted to say yes. God, he wanted to say yes. But something deep inside him already knew time was running out faster than either of them wanted to admit. Elvis crouched beside the bed slowly. "You know what I think?" "What?" "I think you got enough fight in you to scare heaven itself." Christopher smiled weakly through tears. Then Elvis gently touched the boy's shoulder. "And I think brave people never really leave us." Christopher stared at him carefully, trying to understand. Children always understand more than adults think.
Before Elvis could stand, small fingers suddenly grabbed his wrist. "Don't forget me." The words came out trembling, barely audible, but they hit harder than any scream ever could. Elvis froze completely. Something painful moved across his face, because under all the fame, all the screaming crowds, all the gold records and sold-out arenas, Elvis Presley understood exactly what it felt like to fear being forgotten. He slowly wrapped both hands around Christopher's tiny hand. "I won't," Elvis whispered immediately. And unlike most promises people make to dying children, he meant it. Completely. A few minutes later, Christopher's mother returned, carrying coffee cups, and nearly collapsed when she saw Elvis sitting beside her son, holding his hand. The cups slipped from her fingers. Coffee exploded across the floor. She covered her mouth with both hands and burst into tears instantly. "Oh, my God!" Elvis stood awkwardly, almost embarrassed by the attention. Christopher smiled proudly through tired eyes. "Mom," he whispered, "Elvis came for me. Not for the hospital, not for cameras, not for charity. For me." That sentence shattered her completely. She cried harder than before, because mothers know things. And in that moment, she realized Elvis Presley had given her son something no medicine could provide. He made Christopher feel seen, important, wanted, human. Elvis hugged her gently while she cried into his shoulder. "I'm sorry," she whispered repeatedly. But Elvis shook his head. "No, ma'am." His eyes drifted toward Christopher. "You got yourself a real special boy here." The mother nodded through tears. "I know." But the way she said it sounded painful, like somebody trying desperately to hold on to sand slipping through their fingers. Elvis stayed another hour, not because he had to, because leaving felt cruel. Eventually, visiting hours ended. Nurses slowly dimmed hallway lights. The hospital became quieter, sadder, more honest. Elvis knew he had to go. Christopher looked terrified when he realized it, too. "You gotta leave now?" Elvis forced a smile. "Afraid so, partner." The boy looked down. His fingers tightened around the scarf again. Elvis leaned close one final time. "Hey." Christopher looked up. "You know what your job is now?" "What?" "You keep fighting." Christopher nodded slowly. "And your job?" Elvis smiled sadly. "To keep singing." That finally made Christopher laugh again. Small, weak, beautiful. Elvis kissed the top of his head gently before standing. Then he walked toward the door, but just before leaving, he stopped, turned around,
And looked at Christopher one last time. That image stayed with him forever. The tiny hospital bed, the pale little face, the scarf wrapped around trembling fingers, and those eyes, still trying to be brave, even now, especially now. Elvis walked out quickly after that because he suddenly felt dangerously close to crying again. The nurses watched him silently as he passed. Nobody asked for autographs. Nobody interrupted him, because everybody in that hallway understood something sacred had happened inside room 417. Outside the hospital, rain hammered New York relentlessly. Elvis stood beneath the awning for several seconds, staring into the storm. Joe Esposito had finally arrived after hearing where Elvis disappeared to. "You okay?" Joe asked quietly. Elvis didn't answer immediately. He looked exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. Finally, he spoke. "That little boy ain't scared of dying." Joe looked at him carefully. "He's scared people will stop loving him when he's gone." Neither man spoke after that, because there was nothing else to say. 3 weeks later, Elvis was preparing for another Vegas performance when the phone rang. He already knew before answering. Somehow, he already knew. Joe handed him the receiver slowly. Elvis listened silently for nearly a minute. No words, no movement. Then he closed his eyes. Christopher Ashford died that morning. 8 years old. Gone. The room around Elvis suddenly felt very small, very quiet, like the entire world had stepped backward. After hanging up, Elvis sat alone for almost 20 minutes without speaking. Nobody disturbed him. Not the band, not the staff, not even Joe. Finally, Elvis stood up slowly, walked toward his dressing room mirror, and removed the scarf hanging around his neck. Not his stage scarf, a different one, because Christopher still had the original. Elvis stared at his own reflection for a long time. Then he whispered something barely audible.
"Good night, little buddy." That evening, thousands of fans packed the Hilton showroom again. The lights exploded, the crowd screamed, the orchestra played, and Elvis walked onto the stage, smiling like always. But something inside him had changed forever. Midway through the concert, the first notes of "Can't Help Falling in Love" began playing. The audience instantly erupted, but Elvis stood unusually still beneath the spotlight. Then he looked down briefly before starting the song. "Wise men say..." His voice cracked immediately. Very few people noticed, but Joe did. Because Joe knew Elvis wasn't singing to the audience anymore. He was singing to a little boy in room 4117, a little boy holding a scarf, a little boy terrified of being forgotten. By the second verse, Elvis's eyes had become glassy. "Take my hand." He almost couldn't continue. Thousands of people watched silently. Something felt different tonight, raw, painfully real. And for the first time in years, Elvis Presley wasn't performing. He was grieving. When the song ended, the crowd exploded into applause, but Elvis simply looked upward for one quiet second, almost like he hoped Christopher could somehow hear it. Then he whispered softly into the microphone, "This one was for a friend." The audience cheered again without understanding, but Joe looked away immediately because tears had filled his eyes. Christopher's father never contacted Elvis again, never thanked him, never apologized, nothing. But Christopher's mother did. A month later, Elvis received a handwritten letter. The paper was stained with tears. Inside, she wrote, "You gave my son the happiest day of his life, not because you were Elvis Presley, because for a few hours you made him feel more important than your fame. Christopher died holding your scarf. Thank you for seeing the little boy behind the illness." Elvis read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it inside his Bible. He kept it there for the rest of his life.
Years passed. Elvis died. The world mourned. And the story remained secret. No interviews, no headlines, no television specials. Because Elvis never did it for attention. That's what made it real. Then, 20 years after Elvis died, Christopher's mother finally told the story publicly during an interview. People around the world were stunned. $5 million turned down.
just because something felt morally wrong. But the money was never the point. The point was this. Elvis Presley understood something Richard Ashford never did. Dying children do not need spectacle. They need presence. They need honesty. They need someone to sit beside them when the room gets quiet and the fear gets loud. Elvis could have taken the money. Nobody would have blamed him. He could have sung one song, smiled for photographs, shaken hands with businessmen, and walked away richer. Instead, he chose a lonely hospital room, a scared little boy, a guitar, 2 hours of genuine human connection. And in the end, that mattered more than every dollar on that check. Because real kindness isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't perform for crowds. Real kindness walks quietly into room 417, sits beside a dying child, and sings softly enough for only one heart to hear.